All right, it's loading up. I think we are good. Just double check. All right. Yeah, and we are live. Hi, welcome everybody to our newest edition of Emerging Revolutionary War, Rev War Revelry. I'm Billy Griffith, coming to you tonight with two members of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. I have on screen, one is coming in on video, one is coming in via call. I have on screen with me John DiNuzzi, who is the he is the current president, of the Alliance, and coming in via phone call is Lyn Hohmann, who is a previous president and is a current Board of Trustee member. So we're going to talk a little bit about the group's efforts in preserving and interpreting the history of what, in my opinion, is one of the most significant pieces of ground in the entire United States. So I'm going to allow these two to introduce themselves. John, if you want to go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Billy. Good evening. As Billy said, I'm John DiNuzzi. I'm the president of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. I reside in Trumbull, Connecticut. I work full-time when we're not out of the office in Manhattan as a corporate security leader for MetLife. But I have a home in Lake George, and hopefully in the not too distant future, I'll be living in Lake George again. I've been affiliated with the Alliance for 5 years now on the Board of Trustees. And like probably almost everyone on the call, I've been involved with a number of organizations through the years, historical organizations and others. In Trumbull here, where I live, I was the co-chair of a committee that created a memorial to Igor Sikorsky, who lived in Trumbull when he received the patent for the helicopter back in the 1930s. I was also on the board of the Shaker Heritage Society in Albany, New York, which preserves the original settlement of the Shaker sect just out by the Albany County Airport. But we got a lot to tell you, a lot to talk about with the Lake George Battlefield Park. I look forward to sharing that with you. Lyn?
Yeah, hi, I'm Lyn Hohmann. I apologize. I'm up in the Adirondacks, and you probably heard how we don't have the best internet. I thought sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So here I am by phone. Yeah, I was president of the Alliance for 10 years and happily retired in August. I've been a member of the Alliance for 20 years, essentially. And Billy, I'm glad you said what you said about the park, because we feel exactly the same way. The park is a treasure trove of history, of archaeology, as well as just a beautiful park for people to walk around in and enjoy themselves. My past, I'm a physician, board certified in family medicine and addiction medicine, now retired, thankfully. I've been on several not-for-profit boards. I was president of the New York State Academy of Family Physicians many years ago. So I've had a long history of working in community work and serving, I think, the underprivileged as best we can. I currently split my time between Albany and Weavertown, New York. And if you think about it, Lake George Battlefield Park's right in the middle of that. I also have worked as an avocational archaeologist and actually dug in the park with David Starbuck. And after David has passed, I've been very fortunate to be able to continue doing some surface archaeology, working with Chuck Bandry, who is the DEC archaeologist and who is our kind of liaison with DEC, which owns which manages, New York State owns, but DEC manages Lake George Battlefield Park.
All right. Well,
I can say more, but I think that's enough.
so tell us a little bit about, what the Alliance is, what its mission is, what its purpose is, and honestly, how and why it was formed.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back because I talked about the archaeology in the park. That is what triggered the development of the Alliance. I have to say 20 years ago, and I just found documentation of it, people were beginning to think about doing a visitor center. In fact, they had this beautiful 3-story building planned to be a visitor center to bring the history of the park to the community. Nothing happened, obviously. But in 2000, David Starbuck started doing archaeology digs in the park with volunteers and students. He did, I believe, a total of 5 digs over basically 20 years. And it became very obvious that even though our ground depth is very limited, the archaeology, the resources, the artifacts that were there were just overwhelming. And they covered the French and Indian, interwar, and the Revolutionary War periods. And it was just astounding how much was still there, as well as the identification of features. Some of these piles of rocks, we didn't know what they were. They began to take on life. Consulting the history and consulting the archaeology and the field work, it's pretty clear that we had a real exciting place to be, to share, and to bring to the public. And that basically was when the Alliance was formed. Several of the folks who worked in the field went to people in the community and formed the Alliance as a 501c3 not-for-profit organization incorporated under the New York State Department of Education.
Cool, thank you. Well, you're talking a lot about the stuff that has been uncovered there. Well, what is the stuff actually from? For the people who don't necessarily know what the Battlefield Park is, or maybe even where Lake George is, can you kind of, either one of you, John or Lynn, kind of orient us as to what it is, where it is, and what historic events does your Alliance help preserve and interpret there?
Okay, first of all, the park is on the lower end of Lake George. If you know New York State at all, maybe 60, 70 miles north of Albany, New York, is Lake George. Contiguous to that, heading to Quebec, basically Montreal, Quebec, is Lake Champlain. And then from Albany south, well, actually more than Saratoga south, you have the Hudson River. So this incredible system of waterways became a way for people to easily move north and south between Canada and New York City, essentially from pre-contact period up until through, obviously, even now we still use these waterways. So the Lake George Battlefield Park is at the south end of Lake George. If you've heard of Fort Colonial or Fort Ticonderoga, that's at basically the north end of Lake George, and somewhat sort of towards the end of Lake Champlain. So what happened there? Well, there's obviously 10,000 years of indigenous life and activity in there, for which we find numerous artifacts. But then in 1755, we began to, in the beginning of the French and Indian War, one of the first activities that occurred there was the Battle of Lake George, September 8th, 1755, which was a victory for the British. Baron Dieskau was the French commander who was captured. There's 3 skirmishes there. I don't want to go into a great deal of detail, but that was the first incident. In that end of 1755, 56, they began to build Fort William Henry, which I'm sure you've heard about. If you've ever heard of Last of Mohicans. And then in 1757, there were 2 French incursions against Fort William Henry, and the final, which ended up in the destruction of the fort and the famous massacre. So what does Fort William Henry have to do with Lake George Battlefield Park? The entrenched camp for the British, Fort William Henry, was actually in our park. And we still have features in the park that show the entrenchments, believe it or not, from that period of time. It's kind of exciting. In fact, I think the new findings we just made in the park are more of those entrenchments. Really pretty exciting. In 1758, Abercrombie attempted to take Fort Carillon from the French in a very dismal attempt. returned back to Lake George Battlefield Park from which he started. He did build a stockaded fort, and a number of other buildings, which they all knocked down when they left. And then in 1759, Amherst came to that area. He started building Fort George, which was supposed to be one of the largest forts in North America. And then he also had a stockaded fort for folks to live in, the soldiers to live in until the other fort was built. However, he went north, and unlike Abercrombie, he did drive the French out and ended up at Crown Point, where he decided to build his Majesty's fort at Crown Point, leaving Fort George a half-finished structure. And he said, finish the one bastion of Fort George, come up and build this other fort. So Fort George is still in the park, and that is just a single bastion of what was supposed to be this huge fort. It was closed off. There was rooms in there. There was bomb-proofs in there. And that has been archaeologically dug also. It's fascinating discoveries, much more intact than we ever imagined. There's also the stockaded fort that was closer to the lake, and that was dug by David in 2000, and that had 2 barracks in it. But the interesting thing is David could never find potholes to find where the stockaded fort was, where the stockaded edges were. And that's what we just discovered. It was not vertical, it was horizontal stockade. And we have now discovered the outline, surface archaeology, the outline of the stockaded fort. So that's 1759. Now these structures and many others were also used all the way through between the wars and in the Rev War. And the big French Lake George Battlefield Park comes again to the fore in 1776, when it was the Army Hospital for the Northern Campaign with Dr. Potts in charge. What's interesting about that is in February of a couple years ago, they were building a triplex and unfortunately disturbed part of the cemetery related to that 1776 hospital from Dr. Potts that was in Lake George Battlefield Park. And over 40 partial skeletons were eventually collected from the digging of this triplex. They unfortunately dug the whole cellar before they understood they was in a cemetery, so that left a great deal of work for us. And we're now in the process of working to reinter those 40 plus individuals. I'm the head of the ceremonial committee for that Portland Street reinterment, and currently working with the Army and the Pennsylvania National Guard for this ceremony. And why I say the Pennsylvania National Guard is we found, and this is how we dated it, and this is why I love archaeology, we found one gentleman had been buried in his uniform, and he was a 1st Pennsylvania Battalion gentleman, which meant this dated the cemetery to 1775. 1777, of course, Burgoyne came there. He didn't come through this section, but his stores and so forth did come through Lake George Battlefield Park. And then, of course, he lost. So the fort again went back into American hands. And then in 1780, we had the Great Burning in Washington and Warren County, and Carleton came down, Carleton's raid, or called the Great Burning in our area, and Fort George was attacked. The people in there were captured, and the fort was destroyed. And that's our history.
Yeah,
I took a long
yeah, I was going to say that's just the Reader's Digest version, so you can already see and kind of understand why this ground is so significant. With John, was there anything else that you wanted to add to that?
And Billy, the interesting thing, which Lyn once mentioned, but it can't be overemphasized, just how the path from Manhattan to Montreal, basically, and the seemingly complex series of waterways that one had to go through to get from the south in Manhattan all the way up to Montreal was extraordinary. But there weren't really any alternatives. So it makes for interesting history and interesting anecdotes. I mean, one of my favorite, probably my 2 favorite characters, if you will, from the American Revolution are Henry Knox on the Patriot side and John Andre on the British side. legend, which cannot be substantiated, but legend has it that as Knox was heading north to ultimately go to Ticonderoga, Crown Point, to get the cannon to bring to Washington over in Boston, that he stayed at Fort George, which is verified both on the way north and the way back south. And the legend has it that one of his bunkmates was John Andre, who was then part of a prisoner exchange, was being transported from the north, from Canada, down to New York, where ultimately he was exchanged for a patriot. So it makes for interesting history. Ultimately, several years later, of course, Knox was part of the jury that sentenced Andre to death for his role in the treason with Benedict Arnold. But those anecdotes and the fact that, you know, so many of the luminous people in history passed through Lake George, used Lake George, which flows from now south to north on the way to Ticonderoga, carry on, Crown Point, and all that, just makes it all that much more interesting.
Yeah, no, and in a time when, you know, there were no real major highways connecting Canada to the United States, that really is the most crucial pathway for an invasion route north or invasion route south. So it is the main road to defend as well, depending which way you're going. Now, I got booted there for a second, so sorry about that. But going back to the Alliance's work now, some past efforts that the Alliance has really led or played a part on, are there any ones that you want to highlight before we talk about current and ongoing projects?
Let me start with so the Alliance is basically an educational organization. Let me go back to, again, we were founded 2001. We because of the archaeology that we found in the park, but our goal has been education, preservation of the park, you know, understanding the park better, exploring the park, and obviously education. So that has been a great deal of what we have done. So we have a newsletter, comes out twice a year, that we try to have interesting articles about the park itself, as well as scholarly articles by two of our members, Bruce Center and Russ Bellico. I also write some. I don't know how scholarly mine are, but I think they're kind of interesting. I like to do the people in the park who, you know, interesting figures. And then we have commissioned Ernie Haas to show people this park is so gorgeous. It's full of beautiful trees. You don't get the military sense of the park. So we commissioned Ernie Haas, who's a well-known painter in northern New York, who does a lot of nautical painting, and he painted the park as it would have looked in 1759 when Fort George was being constructed, when General Amherst was there. So that was another way, and that painting has been on display. Right now it's on the Lake George Historical Association until we get the Vic open. We've done walks in the park where we actually walk people around the park, and we show them these piles of rocks that they walk by, and they have no idea what they are. And you start pointing out to them, like, this is here a barracks. And then they start seeing the walls. And they get very excited about that. So that's the other, bring it right to the people. One of the things that I instituted, which I always think on, is a thing that will draw people, is we have 4 unknown soldiers buried in the park from the Battle of Lake George in 1755. Now, the key of that battle, which I find so fascinating, it was just fought by provincials. There was one British soldier there, Ayers, who was the engineer, and he survived. So these 4 men are clearly colonials who died in this battle in the Bloody Morning Scout. So I call them, and I find now that everyone's kind of agreeing with me, they are the oldest governmentally recognized unknown American soldiers in the United States. And I kind of chuckle because I say that, and I have a friend who raises her eyebrows saying, yeah, right. But then I saw it actually in a national journal that it was called the four oldest governmentally recognized unknown American soldiers. So I felt pretty good about that. Anyways, on Memorial Day, we do honor them. And we honor them as representative of the thousands of other people that died in that area in graves unknown. And of course, now we have discovered where some of the graves are. But and it's a very popular event. It brings a lot of people who, you know, kind of cherish their history and like to again remember and honor these men. And then numerous community lectures that we go out into the community and we talk about what's going on, you know, what we can do, telling the history. getting people involved and excited. And the other thing I do is I actually walk around the park. When I see people looking at something, I'll stop and say, hey, do you know what this is? We have a tour guide, but a piece of paper that helps, but I will just, and then I'll give them a little bit more information. So that's kind of what we've done, is mainly focused on education. John, do you want to talk a little bit more? Anything else?
Just to, I guess, add on to what Lyn was talking about. Unlike many other, historic sites from the 18th century anyway, it's not hard to get the feel for what it was like to be at Fort George or at the Lake George Battlefield Park in the 1750s or 1770s, because, ironically, in the 1750s through the 70s, the park was largely clear of trees because they used trees to construct the forts and to build ships and things like that. So the landscape, as Ernie Haas's painting indicates, was largely cleared at that point. But still, despite the reforestation, if you will, of the sites, you can really get a feel for it. I mean, the uncompleted Fort George, vintage 1759, even though it's at most 1/4 of what ultimately was going to be the entire fort, looking at that, the remnants of that fort, you can really get a sense for, particularly if you have a good description with you, what it was like, what it was envisioned to be, and what far beyond the trees, what the view to the lake would be. Similarly, we have the old military road, which dissects the battlefield park. That was the route that was used from the Lake George to the Hudson River and Fort Edward. That was actually used by Sir William Johnson and the other soldiers from the 18th century wars. So, I mean, there's just a lot that you can sense, and certainly the creation of the new visitor center that Lyn is the de facto curator of, will really, I think, embellish that, because there'll be some terrific exhibits there that kind of show, what was really there in 1755, 1759, and so on. So you can really get that contrast between now and then, and so, some of the actual artifacts that Lyn spoke of as well from the digs.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that visitor center that's supposed to open in spring of 2022, potentially. So what can visitors expect when they come to the Lake George Battlefield Park? What kind of stuff, if they walk through those doors, what do they can expect to see?
Well, the first thing is we're trying to tell the whole history of the park, and that's 10,000 years, so that's a lot. And we're trying to help the visitors visualize what some of the items that we are talking about on our tours really look like. So the first thing is we have panels that go each year. We have a Native American one, and then we have a series of panels that tell every year from the French and Indian War through the French and Indian War, and then through the Revolutionary War. Dr. Russell Bellico did the yeoman's work on these, and they are spectacular. They're beautiful panels. If you walk around the room, you will get the sense of the history and the persons who were involved and what some of these features are. And so that's one thing we'll have. We'll have the really very interesting, neat nautical corner. We have a model of the Radeau land tortoise. People may be aware that the land tortoise was sunk in 1758 as part of the sunken, hang on 1 second, I'm sorry. Hang on, my computer is being crazy. The land tortoise was sunk in 1758 as part of the sunken, the boats, there are many of the bateaux hundreds of bateaux were sunken, and the Radeau was sunken at the end of 58, so by Abercrombie's troops, so that the French could not get hold of those boats. And then the following year, they were raised again by Amherst's troops. So it was a way to preserve the boats underwater, rise them up, plug the holes, and use them. Unfortunately, the Radeau because of its structure, was very hard to sink. And rather than sinking in 20 feet of water, it sunk in 100 feet of water, about 2.5 miles or so from Lake George Battlefield, the beach area. So that is was never recovered, obviously, and then was discovered a few years back by side sonar, where they saw it and they've actually dove down onto it. And we actually have a scale model of that Radeau that will be in the visitor center, as well as the actual port cover from that Radeau. Additionally, we were offered, and I'm waiting to see if my next grant comes through, a number of the timbers from the 1757, well, it was burned in 1757, the sloop that was sunk by the French in March of 1757. So that will be another piece of the nautical exhibit. Plus, we have what will be continuously running videos to talk about the lost Radeau and the sunken bateaus. So that's one section. We will also have a little section that will be talking about the Hendrick Johnson statue. We will have 2 models of the 2 forts that were in the park. These are beautiful scale models that were built locally by a very skilled, obviously, model builder. One is of the stockaded fort, and the other is of Fort George. Now, Fort George is built on the actual plans that we have for that bastion, how it was built and closed in. So it's an actual scale model. The stockaded fort was based upon what research we have, period maps, and there's actually a picture of part of the stockaded fort that we've used, as well as the surface archaeology that we did to confirm the boundaries of the fort. So I think people will really like those models. They are incredible. We will be having a soldier, a 1776 1st Pennsylvania Battalion soldier. We have commissioned a tailor to create his uniform. Part of it's actually hanging in one of my closets, but he will be there, as well as a 3-pound cannon that has been donated to us. It's a reproduction. It's not an actual, but it is a nice kind of little tableau with our soldier. We also will be having a number of cases. At this point, we have 4, but we will be having, I think, up to 6 if the grant comes through, cases in which the actual artifacts from the park will be displayed. I've been working with the New York State Museum, who is the holder of the artifacts, and we are working to bring an appropriate selection up so that people can actually see what we have found in the park. Unfortunately, there's thousands of artifacts, and we don't have space for thousands of artifacts. So we've been very choosy in picking the ones we think will intrigue people the most. That's pretty much what will be there. Am I leaving anything out, John, that you can think of? The artwork, we'll be bringing in, obviously, our 1759 painting of Lake George Battlefield Park by Ernie Haas, and we have a picture, art and illustration by Zaboli that we just got. We commissioned it, and it will be a picture of the stockaded fort. It's interesting. We just got this. He just finished it. He sent it to us. It is absolutely stunning, and that is right now being framed, and that will also be in there. And it's interesting. There's a number of drawings of the stockaded fort, and the model is going to be a little bit different from the drawing, but they're based upon slightly different sketches that we found. So it's kind of interesting. None of us have seen it. We can only go by the history that we have. So that's some of it. Plus, you'll probably be able to have a video of a tour of the park. And then, John, why don't you talk about our new projects?
The QR? Yeah, well,
QR and yeah.
Right. We're finally, we're leaping into the 21st century technology-wise. We're going to have as we had an intern from Skidmore College, which is down the road about 25 miles in Saratoga Springs. We have a good rapport with the history department there. Had an intern work with us on some of the development work for the VIC, the visitor center. And for the new year, we have engaged service of another history major at Skidmore, who is going to develop basically a QR code based tour of the site so that folks can use their phone and do a self-tour using some of our historian trustees as guides to them, and let them see, what they're actually walking in front of as they experience the various sites in the park. As we've been saying, it's very easy to overlook because it just seems such a naturally beautiful setting to overlook the significance of the history in the park. So we're looking forward to actually making that connection to let that many poor people, and you wouldn't have to be during the visitor center operating hours to do your QR code based tour. One other thing, we've been mentioning the Ernest Haas painting a lot. I just want to reference folks, and I know Billy, you've given and will continue to give our website, georgebattlefield.org. Actually, on the homepage of that site, there's a series of rotating pictures, and one of them is the overview painting that Haas did for us. So you can get a good idea of just, again, what it really looked like in 1759, a cleared land looking from the lake south toward the land, which is just, just another way to represent the beauty and the history of the area.
Awesome. Go ahead.
If any of you have ever heard of Robert Davies, who was a British soldier during the French and Indian War, who was also an artist, you might have seen in different talks his drawings of Crown Point, particularly, where I know he's been particularly been, but he also did one of Lake George Battlefield Park in the same era, 1759, as Ernie Haas's. And it's very interesting because Ernie did it looking from the lake into the campground. Davies did it looking out from the campground. But you'll see if you look at both of them, it's kind of an interesting perspective, several hundred years apart. But again, almost showing the same thing. So it's kind of a fun thing to do.
Cool. So with this new actual facility, that something tangible other than the park that the Alliance can actually use as a resource tool for visitors, are there any, future events or more like outreach to the general public that you're planning to do now?
Is that not what we're doing right now? Of course. Absolutely. I think, and I've kind of passed obviously the baton, but we did a lot of outreach. Obviously, we have thousands of visitors to Lake George, and more when the borders open again more clearly. So yes, I'm sure we'll be continuing with these the visitor center and this QR coding. And John is also, he did not mention that he's also updating our tour guide, so it's a little bit easier, user-friendly. Plus, the one thing I didn't mention is we also updated and brought out, and I know we're bringing it out again, another edition, a Colonial walking tour of Lake George itself, of the whole Lake George. It includes Lake George Battlefield Park, which these are distributed through the through visitor centers, the 2 visitor centers in Lake George, and are very, very popular. So that's another one of our outreach efforts to bring people to the history of the park. And obviously, we believe the ceremonial reinterment of our 40 Rev War soldiers is also going to, be a significant outreach event. And we hope that you will keep that in mind. It will be, we hope, Memorial Day of 2023. The reason it's taking so long is that there is a lot of studying being done on these bones. They're now in the New York State Museum, and it's taken quite a bit of period of time. Obviously, COVID really impacted the ability to work on recovery as well as studying the bones. But I hope that will be another event that people will come to also.
Yeah, as Lynn mentioned, also we do have the Memorial Day ceremony, which may or may not coincide next year with the grand opening of the Visitor Center. We're hoping it will be sometime around Memorial Day. But regardless, we have a very popular reverential tribute to the 4 unknown soldiers of the French and Indian War, Battle of Lake George. that every Memorial Day we pay tribute to them with I think a very simple but very respectful ceremony. And I think that too, Billy, speaks a bit to the context of Lake George. I mean, Lake George is kind of like in the middle when you consider Albany to the south, and certainly Saratoga, where the Battle of Saratoga took place, in Schuylerville to the south. And then, from Fort Edward and working up from Fort Edward, the path that was taken on the old military road all the way through Queensbury up to Lake George, north on Lake George to Ticonderoga, Crown Point. There's just so much happened in that whole corridor. And there are popular individualized attractions for Ticonderoga, and Saratoga National Battlefield Park being the most prominent perhaps. But, Lake George itself, other than the many tourism amenities that people find so attractive there, I see it as kind of like a mini Gettysburg in terms of all the significant things that happened there. It hasn't really been, I think, emphasized the way in an organized way that it could have been. But I think the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance is really an orchestrator. We have a great partnership now with the town of Lake George, the village of Lake George, that they have some people who appreciate the benefits of the heritage tourism to the area. So I think more and more as we do things in the park, it will grow that much more interest in it in places like Fort William Henry and the Lake George Historical Museum, and along the west side of the lake and along the east side of the lake. So it all kind of like works together as opposed to being, individual pockets of history, but really to speak to a common theme. Lyn mentioned the great burning of 1780. One of our members, a guy named Pat Niles, who many of you may know, is putting together a series of historical markers that commemorate the burning that Christopher Carleton oversaw in 1780 from a swath from basically Fort Anne down to Saratoga County and west to Lake George, and then further down into Boston Spa, that area as well. So I think the more we look regionally at this, the more prominent Lake George is kind of a hub for a lot of those activities becomes.
Yeah, definitely. I see it as like the crossroads of two conflicts. Definitely. So now, again, getting away a little bit from the history itself, as people working at, in the hierarchy of this alliance, we don't have too many friends or alliance organizations on these revelries. We're mostly just doing chronological history retellings and discussions. So both of you can answer this because I'm sure you both have your own unique perspective. But what are the challenges, regarding promoting your group and getting the word out, telling the story of the park to the public, actually getting people to understand, so what, why this place is so important and it needs to be preserved and interpreted?
Well, I'm going to answer some of that. Fortunately, we do get a lot of excitement. This whole area there's a whole population of people in this area, and I'd say Albany North, who really do love history. And we have had excellent support from them. For example, Lake George Historical Association, I worked on an exhibit there several years ago before we had a visitor center in order to bring the park to the public. So that's one of the places we've cooperated in the past. We also have had excellent grant support. When we put in grants, we've had tremendous support from the granting community. Say the Solomon Testamentary Foundation, Stewart's Foundation, and the Pomeroy Foundation have been wonderful supporters of us. They helped us update the unknown soldiers burial site, so that we've had that recognition. Now, how do we get to the people who come here to launch a boat? And I say that because that's a lot of what happens. People come to Lake George to go swimming, to launch a boat, to go fishing, to see the sights, to play in the arcades. And that's part of what the walking tours to do, is to let them see when they come into the visitor center of Lake George, to see something there related to history. The other thing is when they park in the park, to give them as they come through the door, come through the gate, essentially, you know, a tour of a sheet with a tour of the park that they might not have ever realized was there as they park their car and then go to the beach. Because we are also overflow parking, which is for the beach on very hot days. So that is some of the things that we need to do is work. You know, obviously the Historical Society folks love us because that's the Historical Society. We also, a couple of other things that we've done, which have been very helpful, is working with the town of Lake George. Several years ago, the town of Lake George, the Alliance, and I was the principal on this, as well as DEC with Chuck Bandry, put together a American Battlefield Protection Program grant. So it's like we were able to get $50,000 grant. And what we did is we studied that grant. We hired Harkin Archaeological, and we were able to identify in the town of Lake George all of the, as much as we could, with extensive research, all of the archaeological sites that were there that people may not have even realized. In fact, it's probably almost probably a 1,200-page document of all the things that were identified and documented in the town of Lake George. It was very interesting because we had 3 public events related to that project, and we had a lot of community interest in what was this about? Was it going to impact development? Which it's not going to impact development. It's just really to document what's there. So that's another thing. And I'm going back to this cooperative actions. That is a big part of, I think, what I did during my 10 years was learn to work with these cooperating organizations, such as the town of Lake George. And that's how we got our first grant to reproduce the Colonial walking tour, was working with the town of Lake George and finding a lot of support and doing it in the sense of historical tourism. And as soon as you talk in a tourist town about historical tourism and how that brings in dollars, it's very important. The other, it's really a winning thing. The other thing is that Fort William Henry does have a number of reenactments, and we have participated and supported them in the past to some extent. But it's another place where people they actually hold it in the park, and I think that we need to take more advantage of tourists in the park at that time. We may not all be reenactors, but we certainly can. There are a lot of people who are watching who might want some history of the park. We were supposed to have the 100-year anniversary of the rededication of the Indian fountain in the park this last year, but COVID kind of wiped us out, and that will be next year. I think John can talk about that. So those are some things. It's partnership, identifying key things that we can accent and be parts of, are some of the things we can do. And I have to say, people from Canada, I don't know if any other people have had this experience, but they know their history, and they're wonderful to take around the park. You start talking about Montcalm and Dieskau and some of these other people, and they're right there with you. And that is it's really fun. Anyways, John?
One of the business adages I always remember from a boss of mine 20 years ago is all advantage is temporary. And so kind of piggybacking what Lyn was just saying, the advantages we do have, we must take advantage of. We have a natural traffic flow, not necessarily history interested people, but people walking through Lake George. And inevitably, there are rainy days when people come to Lake George on vacation. That's our market. And, we can turn a disinterested person into a casually interested person into an aficionado. Ultimately, some of those will contribute and join the Alliance. I mentioned earlier how sad it is, the Saratoga National Battlefield. I mean, it's kind of out of the way, but I mean, it is a unique location in American history. And if you look at surrounding communities around the Saratoga battlefield, they're struggling. And, I see them as potential Gettysburgs, maybe, not to the extent of being the ongoing vibrant community that Gettysburg appears to be to someone who goes there a couple times a year. But certainly some places that kind of reinforce the history of the place. Lake George has natural advantages, and it's up to us to take advantage of those. And I think we will. The partnerships Lyn was just describing, I think everyone involved in those partnerships understands that the rising tide floats all boats. So if it's good for us, it's good for the Lake George Historical Association and vice versa. So that's what we have to do. Your question, Billy, about the challenges, it's attention deficit and competition for people's time and money. But again, we have some advantages there that other places who are really off the beaten path don't have. So we just need to take advantage of those.
Yeah, it's definitely the side of public history that the typical history buff visiting a battlefield or a historic site doesn't always think about. What it actually takes to keep, the money flowing into that site, keeping public interest alive, keeping people coming back so that site can stay open. And we definitely thank you both for taking part in preserving Lake George's really vibrant history there. Now, getting away from your sites a little bit, don't want to take the focus off the Battlefield Park, but for our visitors who now are interested in coming up and visiting Lake George Battlefield Park, what are some of the other sites in the immediate area, but outside the park boundary, that you think they could have an interest in stopping off by and seeing?
Oh my gosh, there's so
Go
many
ahead.
things. Obviously, you have to stop in Saratoga and see Saratoga Battlefield. But there are other, if you come to Lake George itself, what do you want? You want history? You definitely have to go to the Lake George Historical Association Museum. They're an actual museum, and they have a wonderful presentation right now on indigenous cultures, which is, we're not going to do anything like what they do. We're actually going to refer people to their exhibit. It's so beautiful, as well as some contemporary Lake George history. So I definitely would go there. I definitely would get a walking tour and walk around Lake George. There's obviously the Fort William Henry Museum and the reconstructed fort that's there. There are some other little treasures tucked away. There's Grant's Cottage tucked away up on Mount Marcy. There is also, interesting, in Warrensburg, New York, there's just an adorable little historical museum of Warrensburg history, which is much more intriguing than you think it is. They have a wonderful collection there. So there's lots of little gems. Bolton Landing has a wonderful museum that they've just done a lot of work on. Just a beautiful little museum. So there's all kinds of these little tucked away things besides the big, the beach. You got to go to the beach. If you are a diver, definitely go to the underwater Radeau and Bateau. If you can dive 110 feet, you can go see the Radeau, but don't touch it. But the Bateau are there. There's a diving exhibit. You can dive onto them also. You can drive in a boat around Diamond Island, which has a strong historical background to it. And obviously Fort Ticonderoga, Mount Defiance, that complex up there. You can run over and go to Hubbardton Battlefield, which is, again, very, very interesting. Small place, but very, very interesting. And then go to Mount Independence, which is, the site across from Fort Ticonderoga. The Maritime Museum in Lake Champlain Maritime Museum is also fabulous. So that's, if you want a great excursion, those are some of the places to go. Now, obviously, you have to read Bruce Ventnor's book to go to Hubbardton. Billy, I think they have to read your book to do the Battle of Lake George. There's the site of the Bloody Morning Scoundrels there. There's Bloody Pond associated with the Battle of Lake George. Those are along Route 9 coming into Lake George. What have I left out?
Rogers Island.
We
forget about Rogers Island, but that's the actual, and there's virtually no buildings on the island where Robert Rogers trained his rangers in the 1750s. There's a very nice small visitor center there as well. A lot of nice artifacts on there. That part of the island is largely unspoiled. I know it's kind of a different genre. Lyn mentioned Grant Cottage. Very few people know, unless you're a Ulysses Grant buff, that he actually died just north of Saratoga Springs. And the cottage, quote unquote, that he died in is immaculately preserved. It's at the top of a mountain, Mount McGregor, but it's well worth getting to. If you're into U.S. Grant and that part of American history, it's well worth the time after you go to Lake George Battlefield, of course.
Yeah, I'm glad you said Mount McGregor. I couldn't remember which place it was. Let me put in a word for Radeau, Rogers Island Visitor Center. I actually was on the board there for a number of years, and that's another place that we owe to David Starbuck. There were digs on the part in the island years ago by Stott. Actually, I grew up in Hudson Falls, and Stott was a family member, so I knew about Rogers Island as basically a young teenager growing up in that area. But David Starbuck brought the science to Lake George, to Rogers Island, and created in the visitor center a real display of the artifacts. There's also the David Starbuck Memorial Laboratory there, where a lot of the field work was done, not the field work, but the laboratory work on the preservation of the artifacts. And they have several nice displays, of things that would have occurred in that area, but they also have a number of the artifacts. And then you can also walk around the island. They are building walking paths. I don't know exactly, unfortunately, obviously, David Starbuck died about a year ago, and up until virtually on his deathbed, he was still working in the park. And I know that they're still analyzing the artifacts that he found in his later years there. But we owe Lake George Battlefield Park and Rogers Island archaeology to David Starbuck, as well as Fort William Henry's. So he made, I have to say, he made a tremendous impact on our ability to not just know, but to understand the history of our area. And I just want to put a shout out to that. He's greatly missed.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know growing up, some of the first books I had on the region's history were some of David Starbuck's archaeology books. So for the people who can't necessarily make it across the country to go see Lake George Battlefield Park, do either of you have, it could be your favorite or just rattle off a few, any book recommendations for our viewers who might be interested in learning more about the region's history?
Well, David Starbuck's books are a start. Russell Bellico has done some marvelous books, Empires in the Mountains, Chronicles of Lake George, Chronicles of Lake Champlain. Russ Bellico is my go-to guy. I have to say, I'm on the phone with him almost. He is another one of on our board, and he's my go-to guy for history. He has written some tremendous books, and the thing about Russ is his research is impeccable, and that's why he's my go-to guy. His research is absolutely impeccable, so I would strongly recommend his books for a solid history of this area. There are obviously numerous books about the Revolutionary War and the French and Indian War, and obviously this area plays a role in that. But I think Russ Bellico, I think looking at David's books, I have to shout out to Bruce Ventnor for his Battle of Hubbardton book is just a wonderful tour book also. Those are my and again, there's lots and lots of books about the French and Indian War and the Rev War, obviously. I have some favorites of those, but those are mine. So
William Griffith, Battle of Lake George, would be one. And the others, there's another called, I'm sure you know this one, Billy, Ian Steele's Betrayals. Mm-hmm. I think is another excellent account of what happened at Fort William Henry. But the Bellic books are the gold standards. Ironically, you talked about the David Preston tour that you both missed. David had Russell's Empire in the Mountains out constantly to reference. We're talking about the Battle of Snowshoes or where Lord Howe was actually killed and all that. So those are great resources for all of us.
Yeah, I was reading through Dr. Bellico's Empires of the Mountain before this to refresh. Yeah, my copy's definitely worn out. His, like you said, is the gold standard when it comes to the French and Indian War in the Lake George, Lake Champlain region. And I don't think anybody can really top that. But
Yeah, I agree. Yes.
Great. Well, thank you. So, John, I'm going to ask you, as the current president, how can our followers, if they're interested now, become involved with the Alliance, even if they don't live in the Northeast region?
Well, good question, Billy. Get familiar with our website, lakegeorgebattlefield.org, and you'll see there's a lot of the archive newsletters over the last 20 years. They're all in there. And then there's certainly you can join through the website, or you can contact us. There's info@lakegeorgebattlefield.org. Particularly if you have questions, we will be posting on there the activities once we have things locked in. But that's the best way. Just get familiar with what's on the website. Send us questions, and get on our mailing list, because when things occur, we let our folks know. A recent example, the premiere of the Benedict Arnold movie. We were able to get some passes to special previews of that, which we offered to our members, and a number of them were able to attend. So those kinds of things come up from time to time. But we usually, like once a month or so, we'll have a mailing go out just with some miscellaneous information. I think the next one coming up is actually about the anniversary of Henry Knox's stays at Fort George en route to Fort Ticonderoga and on the way back. So that's my recommendation. Go to the website and get on our mailing list. Shoot us a note.
All right, great. Yeah, well, thank you again, John and Lynn, for joining us tonight. We really do appreciate you taking the time out of your Sunday evening to chat with us about your organization and everything that you do. So for our viewers, our next Rev War Revelry will be in 2 weeks on December 12th, and we'll be sitting down with the Friends of the Miller House, Washington's headquarters in White Plains, New York, as they discuss the George Washington during the Battle of White Plains in late October 1776. So if you do have any questions for the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, you can either reach out to them via their website, or if you wanted us to forward any messages to them, please feel free to reach out to us as well. And thank you, everybody, for joining in, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.